Okay, so this part of the series is going to be uh, basically splitting the scholar category into two um, distinct types. And I think this will actually clarify a lot of other confusions as well that people might have just about the kinds of poets and poetry that's out there. So this is I'm not sure. I don't think this will be too long. I think we'll be able to keep it fairly succinct. The main distinction that we're making here is that the sentimental scholar versus the scholar qua scholar, the scholar proper, the I suppose the kind of poet that people think of when they think of scholarly poets. The sentimental scholar is basically, as I'll show on the next slide, they still have a more active sort of personal emotional center. But if they only had that, that would keep them in the sentimental stage. But they are in the scholar stage because they use that emotion to subvert tradition and expectations. And if they're subverting it, that does show an awareness of tradition, usually, and that can be still quite just as deep an awareness of tradition as the scholar proper. And so that's why I have considered them to be both on the same level. Whereas in the scholar proper is using tradition to reappropriate emotion. So this is T.S. Eliot's, who sort of exemplifies this kind of scholar. He has this notion of the objective correlate, where we try to find in poetry an objective kind of description that, without explicitly referring to a particular emotion, still manages to do it justice, capture the atmosphere, the meaning of it. And so basically we've got emotion moving up to transform aesthetics in a sentimental scholar, and aesthetics moving down to transform emotion in the scholar proper. Now, in both cases, there is always going to be a bit of an arrow moving the other way as well, like some proper, like scholar propers, that they will be, I'm sure they will sometimes have emotion come into their work, but it's the general principle that it moves the other way, and vice versa. The sentimental scholar is going to have aesthetics governing the kinds of emotions they talk about as well, but it is typically an arrow moving in the other direction. Okay. So here are just some poets to just give you some faces to these categories. So in the sentimental scholars, we have, and I think it should be relatively easy to see the through line. We've got Walt Whitman, Arthur Rimbaud, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, all, and this is what I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides, they're all icons in a way, and they all talk about themselves. Whitman, Shelley and Byron all do. And they break with tradition in a way that's still in keeping with tradition. And they use their emotions to stand out from the crowd, but they do it in a way that's sophisticated. Whereas you get the scholars, just for a convenient phrase, the proper scholars, who will, like T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Geoffrey Hill, who are more interested in, as Eliot famously said, getting out of their personality, and that is something that Geoffrey Hill he's actually mentioned that quote of Eliot's as something that resonated with him. Okay. And this is just a little slide to show what I mean. I've put the sentimental scholar in between sentimentals and the scholar qua scholar, but that doesn't, I'm not implying that one is above the other. They both are at the same level of development because they both actually have produced, for a few different reasons, they both have an awareness of tradition, but they also both produce a similar effect. But that's going to be in the next couple of slides. Okay. So all we would be doing, all I'm proposing we add is just another subsection. It's not a new line, like a new stage of development. It's just a subsection, the scholar one. And what they are working with is not just emotion, not just aesthetics, but something like aesthetic emotion, which is a good, I think, term to capture what Whitman and Shelley and Byron are doing. And there's a wrought whim kind of hybrid thing going on there, and an appreciative affirmation for their purpose. We both affirm their emotions, but in a way that's more linked to taste, really. And it's more scholarly. It's less about sentiment than a purely sentimental affirmation kind of poem is. Okay, so this is what I want to call sentimental scholars, iconoclasts. So if you like the in popular parlance, iconoclast is often taken to mean icon, and I'm kind of going to use that connotation. Its proper definition is a breaker of forms, and I think that's what they're both of those things at once. So as I've written here, there's someone who takes up the rebellion of sentiment in a way that's sophisticated, someone who affirms emotional realities in a way that wins appreciation rather than the usual neglect, or a kind of superficial affirmation that's temporary and passing. Appreciation is longer lasting, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the next slide. And they often write about themselves. Whitman and Byron actually did that. Whitman's poem, of course, being Song of Myself. And they have a force of personality, which is distinct from the scholar proper, who tries to let the body of tradition speak through them. And Eliot, he talks about that, again, quite explicitly. He says, like, the point is only those who have a personality know what it's like to want to get out of it or to escape it. And that's a part of his essay in which he says that the point of poetry is to write to extend tradition, basically, by participating in it, conversing with it. So you've got these two different kinds of scholar, and they focus on different things. The sentimental scholar, the poem is like this thing that, I don't know, this road that leads back to them, whereas the poem is, well, it's almost the opposite in a way for the scholarly poets. They direct attention to themselves in interviews and things like that to their poetry. They try to live lives in a way that's almost less interesting than the poems they write. And what I'm trying to get at is that there's a kind of manner or charisma that's invested either in the poet themselves or in the poem. They will, whereas and so basically they're, as I've said here, they're different lines of development, but the same level. And both of them have that kind of charisma, or whatever you want to call it, whether it's in the poet, the sentimental scholar, or it's in the poetry of the scholar proper. But, and this is what I'm going to talk about in my next few slides, they both actually share a limitation as well. So what this is basically, I'm going to chart out the legacy of each of these stages of poets. At the sentimental stage, we have what effectively amounts to a splash in the sea. That's the natural element, sea, water, and water is emotion. It's temporary and passing. It can be exciting in the moment, but like the temporary scene that I talked about in one of my recent, I think it was 2 presentations back, it's temporary and it's passing. Then the scholar has what I'm calling a stamp on sand. And this is a stamp either of the personality, in the case of the sentimental scholar, or it's a stamp of the poem, in the case of the proper scholar. And this is longer lasting than a splash in the sea. It does leave an imprint, but I've chosen the sand metaphor because sand it captures the curiously barren effect that poets at this level produce. And immediately I can hear the critics in my head saying, well, in what way is it barren? Whitman, Byron, Shelley, etc., Rimbaud, all of these sentimental scholars, of which there are many, have had big effects on tradition and other poets. And I would say that you sort of need to be able to, it's hard to explain in the way in which they are barren. When you, and I think actually a good way to explain it is to introduce, if I haven't already in this series, the distinction between an idol and an icon. An idol draws attention to it. An icon draws one's attention into what is beyond it, what it represents, what it symbolizes, and the higher thing that it symbolizes. And yes, the sentimental scholar attracts attention to their own personality, attracts the attention of people to its personality. That's what happened with Byron. But that doesn't go anywhere. We're not any more, if we're honest, that doesn't afford us much now, spiritually or psychologically, really. We know that is a distinct personality type, and there is, I think, from the stages, we have to be able to distinguish between the glamorization of these charismatic personality types and the actual reality of the effect that they have and what they stand for or what they don't stand for. That's something that our culture needs to be able to do more broadly anyway, with just personality types in every part of society. But it does apply here as well. But similarly, when you ask what is the effect of a poem like The Wasteland? What does that lead onto? Well, it's a very clear explication of the post-war, not just ennui, but malaise. I'm sure there's much more we could say about it, but again, that is a good and needed reflection of the times, which is what Eliot was trying to do by his own admission. But again, it doesn't lead us anywhere else beyond that. And I'm not suggesting that poetry only needs to be one thing and only needs to be iconic, but there is a preponderance of work written at this stage of development. The sentimental scholar or the scholar qua scholar, who are both and the result is, I think Sri Aurobindo actually talks about the curious lack of any kind of spiritual poetics in the West, any kind of continuous spiritual tradition, and that much of the poetry in the West has been effectively written by personalities and is about personalities of the poets, and that accounts for the fact that there hasn't been any real clear development of a consistent spiritual poetics. And that is, I think, in some ways what this series is trying to provide some tools towards the building of. So, because I think ultimately it needs to be, we need to first of all be able to understand everything we've just spoken about. The lack of a clear poetics that has embedded in it these different stages of development, and which lays out the typical mode or stage of poetry currently, which is between the sentimental and scholars, and lays out the limitations of that and explains how we have arrived here without much of a poetics and a poetic tradition that is both spiritual but also spiritual in a way that's rigorous, and I want to say consistent, because that is something I'm intending to do I'll probably get around to doing a video on that as well, why we haven't taken steps towards that and what's getting in the way of that. But okay, so I think we've touched on there the curious barrenness of both kinds of scholars. So now we get into the sensing stage, and whereas the legacies of the last two was to splash and stamp, this is to subtilize. Now I'm using quite a specific word there, because what I'm trying to get at is that the censor is like the what it does. actually, you know what? This might be easier to explain first, but by going to the squire and then working my way back to the censor. The effect squires have, poets like Shakespeare and Blake and Dante and Goethe, is they create tradition. People follow in their footsteps, write the kinds of things that they wrote. So their legacy is to seed new life. They don't just splash, they don't just stamp, they seed new life. And so the natural element, it's not sand, it's not water, it is a forest, silver, which is a poetic word. Then you get, and poetic because of what my mind goes to is Wordsworth and Tintern Abbey. So now we can start to move back into the sensing stage. The sensing stage is basically like the in-between point between the sand and the forest. In order to turn sand into soil, the sand needs to become subtilized, which is to say it needs to become turned into something which has the right conditions for life to grow in it. And so it needs to be aerated and fertilized, and nitrogen needs to, I think, be present in the soil. And that is effectively what the censor is doing with their poetry. Now, because this is the hardest legacy to actually be able to chart out, the other three are more clearly recognized, I think. It's going to be the sensing stage that in this whole series I think people are going to have the hardest time putting their finger on, because it is quite rare, I think. And we can even go back to the alchemical PowerPoint where we talked about the two different stages in the sensing stage. And there's the fermentation and then the distillation. We get a lot of, I think there are a lot of poets who are at the fermentation stage, like Keats, where there's a general whiff, because remember, scent is the sense, the mode of contact and discernment. They get a scent. There's a general whiff of some essence, something real and living, but they haven't yet learned how to distill it. And so, to tie this into the legacy, the effect, they don't know... they are basically what a sensing poet does. To put it simply, it's preparing the field of language for the squires, and not just preparing the field of language, but preparing people and psychology, and it's subtilizing people's response to something more living and real, which I think ties that up all really quite neatly. So what we have here, this is all four of them charted out. There's not much more to add there. And so the reason, I said at the start of the presentation that this clarifies, I think, a few things. One of the things the main things that it clarifies is the distinction between sentimental scholars and censors, because I think that's easy to confuse. They do look similar at first. They both use tradition in a way that breaks from it. And they both speak from within what they are talking about. But there is a distinction. One is oriented towards emotion, aesthetic emotion, and the other is oriented towards essence. And there's a big difference between the two. And this seems to be a significant point to make. Because, well, if we want to create a poetry and that kind of tradition that we were talking about, a deeper, more spiritual tradition with something higher in it, we need to be able to clearly say what it's not, and even what is close but not it. And a sentimental scholar is close. They sort of have the resources of both emotion and the aesthetic tradition, and so it's like they cover more territory. And I'd like to be able to visually explain the distinction between the two. I think sentimental scholars can be, just like the other scholars, proper scholars, they tend to be at the fermentation stage. They do this thing where they diffuse across a wide range of territory, emotions and aesthetics, and they do it in a way that is really close to tipping over into a kind of distilled essence, but they're not able to do that. They don't do that. I feel like that's a significant point, but I don't know how else to make it to kind of convey what I'm seeing there. And maybe that's just it. Maybe that is it. So essence is a big thing, and possibly there'll be a future presentation on the different kinds of like each stage of development. I think roughly, we'll see. I haven't charted this out in my mind yet, but there are different kinds of ambiguities, or things that appear to the reader as ambiguities, because essence is large. It's quite large. It's like tapping into a reality, really, and that can be ambiguous for people who don't have that direct sense to the essence that is being communicated. And it's like, because the scholar, if we remember, I think this was in 2 presentations back, I talked about the scholar building an edifice and building a structure, and how taste is the approximation towards an essence, towards the inner nature of something, aesthetic taste. But it isn't it. And I think that's what the scholar does. They become bigger and bigger and bigger in their kind of, like, their surface area of their poetry increases from the sentimental poet. And the surface area just like unfolds, and it becomes large enough that it approximates an essence, but it isn't able to distill it like directly. And that seems to be, again, quite a big point to make. And so the next slide. And that's right, they have much more surface area than the purely sentimental poets, but they're both still limited in the material they're working with. Whether it's this kind of a wider personal surface area in sentimental scholars, or it's this wider collective material, as in like something in a poem like The Wasteland, it's still the realm. They're still working with material of basically aesthetics, and forms, and they haven't been able to work directly with essence yet. And so the sensor is working with something larger, even though curiously it cannot. It's not always, I think, recognized by the sensing poets, and how what it is that they don't see it as a largeness. It's more there's an intimacy to it, curiously enough. But it is larger than what the scholar is working with. And it's not larger in the way that the sensor has accumulated more forms, more knowledge than the scholar, because that's again to still come from and operate from the same mode of contact and discernment, the same mode of engagement. It's more just that they're working with a deeper mode of engagement that allows them to work with and capture something deeper. And yeah, and that's what is larger. It has more in it. It's more, there's more folded into it, or something. I don't know. It's hard to articulate. There's more compressed. So it's both larger and yet more compressed. It's hard to put into words, but it is distinct from what the scholar's working with. And the scrying poet, again, their vision is larger than a single essence. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. So thank you for listening.